Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first panel of Policies That Work. This is a new series by the Wharton School that explores how policies impact the lives of everyday citizens. My name is Joao Gomes. I'm a professor of finance at the Wharton School, and I'm also the Senior Vice Dean for Research. I'm also the moderator for today's discussion. We will talk about taxes, tariffs, the national debt, and the future of the U.S. economy. We welcome audiences both on our Wharton campus and live via LinkedIn. Let me introduce you to our two very special guest speakers today, two people from whose work I've learned a tremendous amount over the years. Jeremy Siegel is the Russell E. Palmer Professor Emeritus of Finance. Jeremy is a world-renowned expert on the economy and financial markets and a frequent guest on major news outlets everywhere. His widely popular book, Stocks for the Long Run, has become an essential read for anyone who wishes to understand financial markets and their trends. Kent Smetters is the Botner Professor of Business Economics and Public Policy. He's also the Faculty Director of the Penn Wharton Budget Model, a research initiative at Wharton whose recent analysis of the two presidential candidates' proposals now serves as the benchmark, both in presidential debates and wide media coverage. Before we start our conversation, let me make some housekeeping notes. We will start with a moderated conversation between me, Jeremy, and Kent, and then we'll follow that up by some Q&A from the audience. If you're following us on LinkedIn, you should use the comment section to submit your questions. Anybody in person should use the QR code to submit questions via poll everywhere. Hello, Kent. Hello, hey. Jeremy. Welcome. Thank you for being here.
Good to be here.
Let me start, Kent, with a question that I think is on everybody's minds. This presidential election looks expensive.
Yeah.
Every candidate, both candidates seem to be promising. It started with no tax on tips, no tax on Social Security, child tax credits. Everybody seems to get some sort of tax benefit. Can we afford all of this at a time where the debt to GDP ratio is almost at a historical high? Talk us through that, how you see that as a problem. What's the potential risks that you envision and the damage that might happen in the economy?
Sure. I mean, short answer, no, we can't afford it. Right now, even without either candidate, we are on an explosive path in terms of the debt. Like you mentioned, we're at a historic high. We're at World War II levels of debt relative to the size of the economy. The difference is that after World War II, debt came way down, the war was won, and productivity increased and so forth. And we're on a very different path right now as far as the eye can see on the current policy without either of the candidates. Explosive debt. That means contraction in the economy, lower wages, and then ultimately something has to be done with that. And so you could either try to figure out how to pay it off. If you were to do that, a little thought experiment, suppose that we were to increase all sources of tax revenue across the entire federal government. That means income taxes, pay excise taxes, everything. You would need an immediate and permanent increase of 33%. And suppose that instead you said, we're going to cut all spending. That includes your grandma on Social Security right now. Immediately cut everything across the board. That would be a 25% immediately and forever. And that's just the current path. And that's if we acted today. And so the longer we wait, the harder it becomes. And so the alternatives are things like monetization of the debt, that would lead to even more inflation, things like that. Now, one might say the market is currently betting on the idea that maybe a Congress will get its act together. We don't see big risk premiums, things like that. On the other hand, the data is we're in a really different world today. We're actually in the good times right now. We actually have a world capital glut right now. We have a bunch of people going into retirement. The government's going to benefit from also shifting portfolios toward fixed income demand, things like that. So these are the good days. It's just not going to last for very long. In the 2030s, we're going to have tremendous pressure of lots of things converging. We'll also have growth slowdown as well. And so, here's what I would say, where I know we're going to talk about both candidates, is our fiscal house is basically burning down. Both candidates are just arguing over the furniture. the house is burning down. They're arguing over the furniture. And in some sense, they're both moving in more furniture while the house is burning down. And so we need to have really serious discussions about this, and neither candidates are doing that.
Thank you. Jeremy, I think you're a little bit less pessimistic. I'm going to say it that way.
Yes.
Why are you not so concerned, and what might cause you to reassess, and what sorts of events, developments, policies might make you a little bit more nervous?
Yeah. First, I think I should clarify something. A question I'm asked very often. I travel a lot, as you know. I do appear in media. People come up to me. They ask me, a little bit about the stock market. What do you think? What do you think about the Fed? The very next question is, Professor Siegel, did you teach Donald Trump at Wharton? Now, Donald Trump and I are exactly the same age, 78 years old. I went through Columbia as an undergraduate when he went through Wharton as an undergraduate. So how I react to that question, if I'm feeling a little grumpy, I say, gee, I'm sorry I look so old. If I feel more positive, I say, wow, I'm so impressed that you think I could go from a senior in high school at Highland Park High in Illinois to becoming a full professor at Wharton, skipping college and graduate school. So the answer is no, I did not teach Donald Trump on whatever ideas that he has, even though I taught for 45 years and happy years here at Wharton. So what about the debt? Kent said it's burning down. Let me tell you, I'm not in favor of the debt, and it is on an unsustainable path. I absolutely say that. But let me tell you that there's only one way you're going to get our government and Congress to act. And it's not going to be Kent's fine work with a model. It's not going to be what any politician said. It's not going to be what any commission says. It is going to be the interest rate on long-term Treasury bonds. Now, what do I mean by that? When the market backs up and says, whoa, the government's floating too much debt, I'm going to take that at higher and higher prices, that will spur action, and we're not seeing that now. Now, also, the question is, when might we see that? Now, Ken hasn't put a time. I read your fine report. You were saying in 20 years. When I talk about 20 days, when I'm talking about the market, people say, oh, that's too far in the future. Ken's talking about it gets unsustainable and ramps up in 20 years. Right now, the market is absorbing the $1.8 to $2 trillion annual debt. It does creep up a little bit. And by the mid-2030s, it does get steeper and steeper. And then, I guess 20 years from now, maybe the mid-2040s, it goes parabolic. So what I see is happening is when the bond market starts backing up, and I don't see that soon, that'll put the pressure on politicians, the homeowners. I can't get the mortgage, it's too expensive. Home builders, I can't build the firms that are financing, and say, this is too high. And at that point, the government will be forced to say, we're either going to cut expenditures or we're going to increase taxes, or a combination of both. And I believe neither will happen until the interest rate rises.
Thank you. So I am curious, when do you think the interest rate will rise?
Not within.
Well, let me put it this way. Since I think that, Trump has probably promised more tax cuts than Harris has, it's going to be really important if there is a Republican sweep. which, by the way, the betting markets have been moving up on and are now between 40 and 50%. But if there's a Republican sweep where they take the House, the Senate, and the presidency, then, it's free reign for any goodies the government went on. I imagine, believe it or not, that you will probably see a spike in interest rates on a Republican sweep a couple weeks from today. Although basically, we'll talk about, I think the stock market basically will like the Republican policies better than the Democratic policies, but that spike could happen. But it probably will come down because there'll be some soothing words, and it will depend on what finally gets enacted over time. So we might see a little bit of a spike, but really, I don't see any big increase in interest rates over the next 3 to 5 years. I mean, higher than today, but not anything that I think would be damaging to the economy.
Kent, the Penn Wharton Budget Model put up a study, I guess in March, I think, discussing when you think that debt reaches unsustainable levels. And you think 150, 175% is probably the moment where interest rates really have to respond and the debt really starts to become explosive and unsustainable. What do you think of Jeremy's thoughts about interest rates and what assumptions are sort of critical for that view that 150, 175 is probably the upper bound how far we can go?
Yeah, I mean, definitely the 175 under the most optimistic calculations. So the world right now has a tremendous amount of capital, and that definitely helps the government. They are able to sell still at higher price, a lower return. And then as people are going into retirement, their demand for lower risk assets also helps as well. That if anything, rates should be lower now than historic, simply because of that capital glut, simply because of portfolio changes. The demographics should actually imply lower rates. But as we go forward, because the spending increase, it actually happens very soon. It's how the markets respond. And the markets are basically, we do this calculation that basically says, suppose the markets constantly believe that Congress will eventually get its act together and the presidency will eventually get its act together and create sustainability. Even under those, call it myopic expectations, we got maybe 175% of that GDP ratio before it's just not mathematically possible, either without explicitly defaulting or implicitly defaulting, either through monetization, it would be higher inflation, or another type of implicit as on pay-as-you-go liabilities like Social Security, Medicare, and things like that. That is just a pay-as-you-go liability. I think, stepping back a little bit, I'm constantly asked about this. We worry about debt. Why doesn't everybody else worry about that? And it's because we've become numb to the idea of crisis. And you think about COVID, think about 2008. I remember you were talking with Bernanke after 2008, an event that we had sponsored at that point. And, you even mentioned how the risk premiums were very high, even especially relative to the Great Depression. How did we get out of those crises? More debt. The problem is, and so we kind of think we can solve all big problems, more debt. When the crisis is because of debt, you don't have that lever anymore. And that's the problem, is that you've run out of options. It's always like, oh, wow. And then it's too late at that point. And let me just say one last thing, and that is we spend a lot of time on validation. So people often ask us, why don't we see a relationship between debt and interest rates, but not a super strong relationship? Well, that's because most of the identification that people have used in the past has been cyclical changes in debt, where the supply of debt and the demand for debt are changing at the same time. We're actually able to replicate that low correlation with our framework when you have those shocks, those what's called TFP shocks. The problem that we're really on right now is on a secular basis. That's where you get the big macro effects. And again, this 20 years thing, that is like, outer bound, feel good. Capital markets really believe something's going to work. And I'm often asked, like, once when could it happen earlier? And it's like, well, when the capital markets want to wake up, it could
Yes.
backward induct till tomorrow. And so
Yeah.
it really comes down to, we know about fixed income markets too. One last point is that they tend not to bend, they break. It's bank run problems. They tend to panic. And people say the U.S. is too big to fail. No, there's definitely things that can happen for the U.S.
I want to ask Ken. I mean, we all remember the Reinhard Rogoff book that came out, what was it, 15 years ago about? Called This Time is Different. It made a huge splash. It was talking about the debt crisis in the United States. It said that we would have a crisis when debt reached 80 to 90% of GDP. So, is this a Chicken Little,
Well,
the sky is falling. So now it's 150 or 200. We haven't had a crisis at 80 or 90. We blew through 80 or 90. All the industrialized countries blew through 80 and 90. Of course, they found mistakes in his work, but it didn't matter. And then we had Erskine and Bowles. Remember the Erskine-Bowles Commission that was in 2010. Erskine and Simpson. Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson was a Republican from Wyoming. Erskine Bowles, I guess, was chief of staff under Clinton. And they had the commission. They went on a road show around the country, hundreds of presentations, serious people about how serious the debt was. That was 14 years ago, and I was going to bring down the country. So what happened?
Yeah, a couple of things there. One, with the Reinhard Rogoff, I mean, they actually never said it was crisis. They were basically
contracting economies.
Yes, you were going to have some effect on the economy starting at that point. Yeah, but there was an empirical relationship. The type of model we had to solve for this problem is, until 5-6 years ago, was viewed as kind of a quantum computing type problem. We had to use advances in math and computation to be able to solve this type of framework. And we really rigorously tested against past data to see if we could replicate these relationships when you actually have these counter-cyclical changes in debt. And that's what, and basically what's different about our calculation is that you reach a point you actually cannot solve the model anymore. Economists talk about our transversality conditions. It doesn't hold anymore unless you do some type of default. And so one last point here. People often look at international and they'll say, what about Japan? 200%, more than that now, that GDP ratio. And what they don't realize, first of all, there are accounting differences of how we count things. Japan also has a household saving rate 10 times that of the United States. And so on a national saving rate basis, Japan actually has a higher national saving rate, netting out the public debt, than the United States. And so we're not Japan, and it's not right to always do those comparisons. And some of those international things, we're mixing lots of those things with just controlling with fixed effects.
Well, let me talk about policies and switch a little bit. Jeremy, there's lots of places where Vice President Harris and former President Trump disagree. But tax policy, perhaps two of the most notable costly implications of their proposals are President Trump, or former President Trump, wants to extend the tax cuts to the higher income and also the capital gains and the corporate income tax as well. Vice President Harris proposes to sort of eliminate those and effectively increase taxes on the higher marginal payers and also increase the corporate income tax. Help us think through, how do you see the impact of that on the economy?
Okay, so
what's good about it?
There's some very important dates here. As all of you know, the Trump tax cuts expire on December 31st, 2025, not this year, next year, because they're 7 years, because they were done on a reconciliation. This is why it's really important not only who wins the presidency, but who wins the House and Senate. Because if there's blocking, in other words, let's say the Senate looks like it's going to go Republican. The betting markets are over 80%. Okay, that's going to switch. The House is very close. So if the House is different from the Senate, then there's going to be a huge negotiation on taxes. We may really see a year and a half, a lot of taxes, because they automatically revert on January 1st to the Obama rates and all the Obama rates. Now, interestingly enough, I didn't know this until I looked it up. The corporate tax rate was permanent. It is not one of those that actually expires. But however, everything's on the table, right? I mean, the Democrats are, if they take the, if the Democrats take the House, they're going to go to the Republicans, say, yeah, you want this. How about giving us 3 or 4 points on the corporate tax rate if you want to do that? So everything's going to be on the table. It's going to be huge. Now, if the Republicans sweep, then, they can say we're just extending all the tax cuts and more if the bond market will take it. So that's important. On the corporate tax rate, I actually don't think it should rise. I think that we were losing. I mean, even the Democrats admitted under Trump that it was too high. They didn't want to bring it down as much as he did. But we were losing in headquarters here in the United States. People were going, and that really did stop. And since we tax capital income, question of the corporate tax rate, is it really, is that really double taxation or not? So I would like to see, I'd like to see the corporate tax rate really sort of remain the same rather than going up. I know Trump is talking about actually lowering it as far as that's concerned. But again, I think really the bottom line, what's going to pressure all these politicians is basically what's going to happen to the bond market and the interest rate. And if it goes up and they say, you're going to do too much. And by the way, Reagan's take 2 examples. Reagan, 1980, when he had tax cut, actually the bond market backed up. Congress went back and closed some loopholes. The bond market got satisfied. Most important, and it's all in our memory because it happened, I guess, less than a year ago. Remember Liz Truss at the UK? She thought she was another Margaret Thatcher and decided, I'm going to cut taxes 20% and stimulate the economy with no revenue coming in. Well, do you all know what happened to the bond market? It fell apart. She became the shortest serving prime minister in 400 years history of the UK. She was out. And now actually the bond market went back to normality, and actually UK is doing pretty well as an economy. But what got her out? The long bond. The long bond got her out. What was going on in the financial market? That is the market that tells the politicians whether they have to act or not.
Kent, you scored both of these policies as sort of negative for growth and long term anyway. Talk us through why do Penn Wharton Budget Model think that these are sort of bad ideas for?
Yeah. Well, we never use the word bad, but it is true. We both.
I did.
You did. We have on our website plenty of options that actually grow the economy while reducing debt. It just happens to be both candidates added debt while actually contracting the economy. So when you think about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, as Jeremy pointed out, it was ran through reconciliation. There's this bird rule thing. And so basically what they did is they made permanent the stuff that was less politically sensitive for the longer run, things like the corporate rate, a lot of the business side. Some of the business side is already expired on depreciation, accelerated depreciation, and so forth. What they purposely allowed the sunset that is expired in 2025 would be the more politically sensitive things like individual rates, and therefore knowing that those be renegotiated. It's a very
state taxes
and things like that. Yeah, the problem with extending those things going forward is that they're costly, but they're mostly inframarginal. They're not like the corporate rate, which has more of a marginal effect on investment. Inframarginal means you're giving away money and you're not stimulating a lot of investment. And so that's also true with not taxing Social Security benefits and things like that. By definition, lots of those things decisions have already been made. And so there's not a lot of, except for the corporate rate for the reduction, there's not a lot of marginal incentives in the Trump package, but it's also very costly. By the way, also getting rid of the SALT limit. Again, another 1.1 trillion bucks, very little incentive effects. And so for the most part, Trump is way more expensive. Also, a debt increase that does. He gets some bump in early years, but in later years crowds out capital. Whereas Harris is a lot cheaper. On the other hand, still deficits. And the reason why her plan tends to contract the economy is she's also using only the corporate rate, which does have big marginal effects to try to fund it. But I will say the big but with Harris is that, there's so many side conversations that campaign is having, making promises to lots of people. It's hard to score rumors. I'd say, Trump is clear but expensive. Harris is cheaper, but it's a little cagey what it actually is. And people are taking all sorts of guesswork, and it becomes like clickbait on different news articles of what she's standing for and so forth. That makes it very tough to score. But nonetheless, neither candidate has really proposed anything that both reduces debt and grows the economy.
Let me follow up, and then I'll give Jeremy a chance to answer. You would lump there the perhaps the most expensive proposal of Vice President Harris is the child tax credit, and you would classify that as equally being inframarginal, i.e., essentially a transfer without much positive impact on growth.
Yeah, I mean, you would have to believe that people have more kids because of the child tax credit. I mean, one of her price or options is actually a first-year bonus, and that is the very first year that of your newborn, you'll get an extra bonus during that year for the child tax credit. We don't really see a lot of evidence between fertility and the child tax credit. It's mostly inframarginal. A lot of the storytelling about, well, this allows people to go back to work and so forth, that's just completely wrong. All the evidence is that child tax credit, UBI, things like that actually reduce labor supply, not increase labor supply. It is true that we shouldn't mix these programs. Things like pre-K education, sufficiently targeted on a means-tested basis, targeting households who otherwise would not have sent their kids to pre-K education. That can actually pay for itself. But the problem is you have to get away from 10-year budgeting, look at longer budgeting, 30-year budgeting, which is now being discussed in D.C. to whether Congress should actually switch to our approach of 30-year budgeting.
Jeremy,
who are we to believe? Let me. You didn't mention the state and local tax deduct, which is a huge issue.
That's another 1.1 trillion.
So let's go over that. Conservatives and Republicans for years have been trying to get rid of the state and local tax deduction because it means more to the blue states. So when Trump became president, the House and Senate, they had eliminated. Democrats were screaming bloody murder. Oh my God, it's against that, against the people there, the schools, etc. We're going to repeal it as soon as Biden gets in with the Senate and the House. Guess what? He keeps every penny of Trump's state and local tax exemption. I remember the New Jersey, I'm not in New Jersey, I live in Pennsylvania, but New Jersey senators were elected on that they were going to bring back the state and local tax deduction. When it came to the votes, both of them caved into Biden and both of them voted to continue to exclude it. And now what? President Trump goes to the blue states and says, I'm going to bring back the state and local tax deduction. So who are you going to believe? What are you going to believe? Do these people mean what they say? On both sides, they did exactly opposite of what they said. And there are billions here at stake. By the way, state and local tax deductions, if Congress does nothing or is deadlocked, come back on January 1st, 2026.
Yeah.
Jeremy, and to be fair to former President Trump, one of the policies that he proposes that makes his plan considerably less expensive depending on what you believe, is tariffs, which was not part yet of the Penn Wharton Budget Model's assessment. How much revenue is there? What are we to believe? Is this an actual proposal? Is this a bargaining tool to be used? What do you think as an economist? What's your best assessment? We don't have a lot of good models to think about this. We haven't done tariffs for a very long time at this kind of level, certainly not worldwide. What do you think of this as a policy, both on the revenue side and on the economic
Here's another
impact?
interesting thing. You know, he put on tariffs. Did the Biden administration take them off? Very few of them.
Yep.
Okay. And they had all three branches of Congress. Again, listen, you know, what are the politicians say? Well, a tariff is like a value-added tax. It's, which, by the way, interestingly enough, conservatives and Republicans have hated and would never want and never voted for, because that's just another way to get money for the government in addition to all the income tax on that. It's like like a sales tax, an extra tax. I do think that Trump wants to use it more as a bargaining tool, although I'm just telling you what a 20%. Now, I think the dollar would rise. You know, if you do macroeconomic models on trade, a 20% tax would cause the dollar, I'm going to say, maybe rise 10%. That offsets 10% of the price impact on that. They will be getting some revenue from that, but now you get the possibility of retaliation. And you get the possibility of, okay, you're putting a tax on me, I'm putting a tax on you, and then you get I think the Smoot-Hawley tariff of the 30s is overestimated as being a cause of the Great Depression, but globalization is a net plus for the world. And if everyone retreats to barriers by taxes, that's not going to help anyone.
Mm-hmm. Kent, this is one policy you haven't scored yet, in part because I think retaliation makes this really difficult to study. What's your best guess at this point, or how soon are you coming up with an actual study on this?
We're waiting a little bit more for details because there's really two stages to this. One is a game theory stage, saying, is this purely posturing? And depending on the details, it could actually, because we've seen this in the post-war era, threats of tariffs often led to more trade, not less trade, as other countries lowered their tariffs to basically back off. But then the second thing is if we actually do move forward with it, how do other countries respond? And that has typically not been incorporated in scoring analysis in DC. And so we're having discussions with those groups as well, how to think through that. So we're waiting to see on some of those details if that were to go forward. Here's the biggest cost of tariffs. It's not just prices. Some of the price effects that you've seen in the media are a bit embellished. They ignore substitution, that people substitute toward cheaper products. There's some embellishment, the exchange rate effect that Jeremy talked about, and so forth. But the real cost of tariffs, and this is what the Trump administration, when they were the administration, ripped into us because they didn't like us pointing this out, was that it's actually not so much in the current account side, it's actually in the capital account side. And when you have more debt, that also lowers the capital flows across countries. And that actually makes it harder for the government, our government, to sell debt. We're not just selling to, right now, about 40% of federal debt is foreign take-up of our debt. And so that would fall a bit. And therefore, the pressure on prices and interest rates would increase. And so it's the capital side I'm more worried about. You can't have both. You can't pretend like the United States is a banana republic, small open economy, no impact, that has no impact on prices, and then shut it down as a closed economy.
What's your ballpark guess of where the revenue would be, the 10-year revenue would be?
Around zero.
Around zero.
Yeah, I think so on a pure static basis, if you have no reaction, it's about $2.5 trillion positive. With a reaction, it could be a negative depending on what you think.
The reaction would be just the economy contract, would be retaliation. What would it?
It'll be both. It'll be both the economy contracting and mainly it's the retaliation. By the way, there are this isn't a pure value-added tax. A pure value-added tax is across the board. This is a very selective, tax. And I agree with Jeremy. Both parties, Republicans hated VATs because they were sneaky. Democrats hated VATs because they were flat. That's why I tell them, we both hate it. That's why you should love it. But in any case, nonetheless, they do raise a lot of money. There is an argument for things what border adjustment in the terms of carbon, for example, and that is having things like a tariff based on carbon content and so forth. It's actually the Europeans who are doing that, not so much us. It depends where we end up with some of that. But nonetheless, because that would address some of the externalities produced by carbon, which are big.
Jeremy, would you agree with
the retaliation is the big thing, and that would cause a contraction, and that causes a deficit. I mean, if the economy contracts, you're going to lose much more in tax revenue, I think, than you would gain on the side of the tariff itself. So that is not going to be a net positive, which actually makes me think that he's going to use it as a bargaining chip more than anything else, even though, he could. Of course, it's also, we haven't talked about, 60% is what he said on China. And really, I mean, and, being anti-China is very popular in Washington today. And so, higher tariffs on China would cause a lot of production, go to India, maybe Mexico, et cetera, and so on. Although, of course, he says it has to come back to the U.S. not to get any tariff, but you're going from a 60% to a 20%. So you would get more of that nearshoring impact that's happening anyways. It's happening now, even before that you have that. But that would be accelerated. The nearshoring would help those. India would probably help, and in Mexico in terms of if there is something like a big tariff that's put on China. But again, the realities are that would really raise the price of a lot of things that are that people buy that says made in China. There will be a political reaction on that.
Let me switch to a few questions from the audience. Jeremy, you talked a little bit about the stock market already, and maybe the common wisdom, maybe not. But what do you think that the election of either candidate means less than 20 days from now?
Right. I mean,
for stocks and bonds.
When Trump was president, he almost measured his success by the stock market kept on hitting new highs. It keeps on hitting new highs under Biden. Then, of course, Trump says it's because they expect him to be reelected or not. The truth is the economy is really doing quite good. It's interesting. Republicans were always thought to be pro stocks. Democrats have become more pro stocks. Don't forget, 1950, 1960, only 20% or less of Americans had any ownership in stock. Now, if you go through IRAs and all the rest, it's virtually 50%. So the average person is more positive towards things that are good for the stock market. The politicians recognize that there's more good for the stock market. On net, because of him being easier on capital gains, and Harris has already said she wants to tighten that capital gains. On net, because of regulation, probably you wouldn't say on net because of antitrust, although, Vance has said that he wants to, there's a little bit of back and forth on that. I would say that the stock market would prefer a Trump victory. I mean, I do want to bring you back to 2016 when they were scared to death of Trump, and in the hours on the November 5th date, the stock market plunged for a few hours when he won and then started going straight up because they said, just a minute, he has the House, the Senate, and the presidency, and they want a tax cut on capital. Hey, this is going to be good, and the stock market soared. So you saw a turnaround in 24 hours in terms of what it's going to be. Now, as far as, as I say, they're going to look at what's going to happen, because if the House goes, damn, now we may not find out for a number of days. It could be that close on the House. It could be close on the presidency. So, we wouldn't know right away. But if the House, then that a sweeping Republican tax cuts where one party, that's why I think the market kind of likes a split. They like the Republican capital position, but they like to split to keep tabs on some party just saying, all right, I want all these goodies for everyone, and blowing up the deficit. And that would probably blow up interest rates in that 10 years.
I think the market wants gridlock. That would be the perfect outcome for them.
I think a big Republican victory, and they think they may want that because it means the extension of that tax cuts, but I think the bond market is not going to like that. And so as a result, there's going to be a tossing and turning on that particular issue.
And the other market that really matters for the average American is the housing market.
Yeah.
And at least one candidate has some specific proposals on this, which I don't remember if you scored yet or not.
Sure, we did. Yeah.
What do you think? What do you think is the best candidate? That might be too strong. You don't want to say that. But what do you think of the impact of those policies and maybe unsaid policies that President Trump has?
Sure. So candidate Harris has proposed up to $25,000 tax credits for first-time home buyers. And here's obviously what she anticipates in terms of supply, of being able to create that supply. It's unrealistic. It requires way more time to build all those homes and so forth. Here's what I would say is that younger people today are really hit hard when it comes to owning a home. If your vision is about owning a home, there's multiple things going on against you. One is that there's still pretty strict supply. We also, where you want to live, there's big zoning that's often local. But also think about a lot of the stock market run up. It hasn't really been benefiting a lot of younger people today or coming out of college and so forth. It's really been benefiting older people, middle-aged people, and they now have this wealth and they can bid up housing prices. And so I don't see it really having, younger people are under much more pressure if they want to be able to buy a house. Do I think that, from a policy perspective, a first-time, buyer credit is far from optimal. I mean, it's like in the third best kind of category. I mean, the first best would bring rates down. And how you bring rates down is through sustainable debt policy. And that is way more important than a $25,000 credit. I mean, think about doubling your house bill as you go from a 3% borrowing rate to a 6 and 7% borrowing rate, way more important than a $25,000 credit.
Jeremy, as you made it very clear, you're sort of comfortable with the debt continuing to drift up, and you're not really that troubled with some numbers. But
I think, and let me elaborate a little bit on that. I mean, we talk about debt to GDP ratio, and we're taking U.S. GDP. We have to understand 1/3 of the debt is owned by foreigners. So the U.S. portion of that is down to 2/3 of that. Now, some people say, well, they could all sell it. I don't see that happening. I mean, that went from 0 in the immediate post-war, keeps on going up. It's 30. But if you lock it at, you should take either the debt to world GDP ratio, which has gone up as the rest of the world has developed, or take the U.S. portion of it. Doesn't look as scary. It still goes up, on a steep path. I've also looked at the debt to wealth ratio, taking total stock market, real estate, and other wealth, and that actually goes up even more gentler, again, toward the 2040. And don't forget, we haven't, it's Medicare and Social Security, mostly Medicare. I mean, it's like, I think 3 times as important. It really, starting in the 2035, 40, it starts going up. When I did debt to wealth, U.S. held debt to U.S. wealth, that instead of coming to twice GDP, actually just got to the GDP level that it got to at the end of World War II by the end of the CBO forecast, what is it, 2065 or something, somewhere that. So Right now, I see an ability to absorb the deficit that we have. Again, I think the bond market will warn us of that, and that's the only thing that will push politicians. Again, there might be a little spike because people will think about it when Trump wins and with all the goodies being promised. But I don't see the bond market backing up anytime soon. I think the bond market is backing up now because growth is much stronger, and the Fed is basically by its saying it's going to be looking at unemployment has taken recession not off the table, but lowered its probability, and that's one reason. I expect actually long rates to go up from the current level, but when it squeezes, when it, oh my God, if it starts going to 6 to 7, 8, we're talking about home, and you're right, that's much more important than mortgages. We talk about home prices since March 2020, when the pandemic began, are up 45% by the Case-Shiller. But if you take the cost with the 80% mortgage, it's gone up almost 150%. Mm-hmm. And by the way, I think Kent is right. I mean, starter homes, if she's going to do it the first time high, starter homes, if you don't increase the supply, starter homes will go up by $25,000. So you're going to get a credit for $25,000 and the price will go up by $25,000. Unless you increase the supply of those homes, there's absolutely no net benefit to the individual going on.
Okay, a different question. Kent, policies that used to be dear to the Democrats were high minimum wage. We don't hear much talk about that. Maybe I missed it. What do you think of the cost of those policies, the damage to the economy, or the benefits in terms of employment levels, which have been hotly debated in the last decade or so?
That's a much more of a regional debate now rather than a national debate. So in California, for example, and so forth, and I actually think that thinking has also evolved as well. Minimum wage is typically not the most effective way of doing redistribution. And the reason why is that we now have an earned income tax credit. It's usually a lot more effective at doing that redistribution. Here's the real way to think about minimum wage. It's basically a tax on employers who employ low-wage workers, not taxing all the employers who basically have very few low-wage workers. But the employers who have low-wage workers also tend to be low-margin employers. There's a reason why the Googles and the Facebooks and the Amazons, they're okay with minimum wage. It doesn't hit them. Whereas if you had to fund the EITC, you would fund it from general revenue using the corporate rate as well as taxes on higher wages and so forth. For the most part, minimum wage is dominated as a policy by the earned income tax credit and other forms. And so personally, I think a proper, traditional Democrat should be fine outside of the winning local elections, should be fine just kind of allowing it to wear away in terms of real value and focus a lot more on mechanisms that are much more broad-based in financing and much more, I think, effective. It's like their income tax.
Yeah, I totally agree. I was told by one major politician here in Philadelphia that there's tens of thousands of people that don't take the EITC that are qualified to. They're just ignorant of being able to do it. And he was talking about an education program. Hey, you can get money from the federal government on EITC, and that is a far more effective way at redistributing income to low-income groups.
Look, one thing there, so this also comes back to the promises of both sides. Both parties are so disconnected from reality that the stakes in the ground that they've made don't make any sense. So on the left, it's about we're never going to hit households below 400,000. That's just mathematically impossible. There's just not enough money at the high income. A lot of people don't realize this. The United States already has by far the most progressive income tax system in the world, relative to the OECD, let's say. And you say, but wait a minute, we don't get very much revenue. That's the reason why. It's so progressive. We don't actually get much revenue. 10% of households in the United States pay about 75% of non-payroll federal income taxes. 50% pay zero. And of those, about half of those claim the earned income tax credit. And so we already started from the super progressive system. And then the OECD, by the way, instead of it being 10% pays, 75%, it's closer to 30-some% to pay that 75%. So we're way more taxpayers. We're way more progressive than the rest of the OECD. But it also means we get a lot less revenue because we don't have things like value-added taxes that are much flatter. This whole debate about who pays the taxes is very much a U.S. thing. You don't have this in Europe. They don't argue about who pays the tax. They argue how the money is spent. And it's a very U.S. Type thing. And so right now, we're both, making these, both sides are, the Republican side, saying we're never going to touch Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, including increasing the retirement age. This is not mathematically possible either. Both sides are placing stakes in the ground. When it comes to earned income tax credit, I mean, the take-up rate is definitely much higher than some of the other programs, things like food stamps and so forth. I will say that a lot of times economists say, well, that's just because people don't understand it. I grew up in one of those households. We understood it. We chose not to take it. And so a lot of households just choose not to take things like the food stamps and so forth simply by choice. It's in terms of information, yes, there might be some information gap. I don't think it's as big as we often think.
Yeah, I think we should also talk about untaxed capital gains. That's a Harris and Democratic issue.
Let me ask you about. I wanted to.
Maybe you're going to get to that. I was
going to ask you about something else. That it's a big group of policies, which terrorists, I think, is just a small manifestation, which is industrial policies, which we hadn't thought about, I think, for decades. And I think now both parties are, in one way or another, trying to engineer winners across various industries and reshoring manufacturing. This, I think, how it started maybe a few years ago. How do you think through that? What do you think are there any good ideas in there in the mix that you like?
I think there's this feeling, let's bring back the halcyon days of the 60s when, that manufacturing jobs were very high paying, among the highest paying jobs. That's just not the world today. The loss, it's in their minds. I mean, in Trump's minds and even Democrats' minds, I want to bring manufacturing back here where they've got really big wages, and that's just a different world. I mean, than we have.
CHIPS Act, for example?
I mean, the CHIPS Act is a security. I mean, and that's another issue. I mean, the CHIPS Act to bring back critical issue. I mean, look what we saw with even COVID. Critical things were being done outside the United States. We couldn't get the medical masks and things that hospitals needed. So we have to identify a few of those, and that was a source of the CHIPS Act. Now, industrial is, we know better what direction we would like the economy. That, I think, is dangerous and has not been successful around the world. I mean, we have a dynamic economy by letting the market tell us where the public wants those demands and where that that production and is going to go. But I think a lot of it, this hasn't been so much direct outside the CHIPS Act, because security and a couple of those other acts. It's not been, we want to favor this. We want to bring the manufacturing jobs back here.
I was going to say EVs.
Yeah, EVs are.
I could come up with many examples.
Yeah, right? I mean, but the EVs are bounced around with the climate thing, back and forth. That I think is mixed with the view on climate more than anything else.
They're expensive, right?
Yeah,
they're very expensive. These are.
Oh yeah.
And they're likely to be even more expensive than we thought.
What do you think?
We had to reset our scores simply because the way Treasury interpreted certain words contrary to the English language. And so it was the most bizarre interpretation. So we had the Inflation Reduction Act went from being slightly positive revenue to big revenue loss because of the EVs. Here's what I'd say. Historically, the evidence of picking winners and losers, we've had many experiments. Japan tried that in the post-war era. And the MIDI and the Ministry of Finance, and what were the industries they discouraged Japan from expanding on? auto manufacturers as well as consumer electronics. The belief was there's no way Japan could be competitive against this monster United States in those areas. And they basically got everything wrong. And Japan did not grow because of industrial policy. They grew in spite of really poor industrial policy. They just had a really good high saving rate combined with good education.
I'm going to try to finish on a happy note. Jeremy, of all the proposals in this campaign, what's your favorite?
Oh, boy. I mean, I was looking at that policies that work in parentheses and the candidates' policies which don't work.
Yes.
Thinking as far as that's concerned, there is no. I'm trying to think. No policy that I see outside of getting rid of. I mean, a couple of things are possible. A lot of waste in government. Who knows whether Trump with Elon Musk, who, had another controversial figure to say the least, but has cut costs more than any other manufacturer probably since Henry Ford, can do to cutting those type of expenses that you have. Certain regulations too much red tape on the part of government to make sure that things get approved that need to get approved. And no one has mentioned education, and here we are at the Wharton School. Isn't it interesting, despite the fall of educational standards in the United States at the second, and we have really great graduate schools, no question about that, and some of the finest colleges, but at our secondary primary school, it's really bad and getting worse. And I don't hear anything from either of the candidates in terms of that at all. And that is, if you're going to increase the standard of living of the population, you have to train them for the 21st century jobs. These manufacturing jobs, manual jobs, so they're trying to bring it back at those days when you didn't need the level of education that you do today to get those sort of wages. And no one is talking about, well, how do we educate our young to get the skills that they need to get the wages in the new economy?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to say, to be fair, the Democrats talk a lot about forgiving student loans as a major.
Well, that's another issue.
I presume that's your answer.
I mean, should we have? Yeah, they do. You're right. The forgiveness of loans and how should we finance higher education? But I mean, I think the problem, as I said, starts more before that. I mean. I think it starts primary and secondary school levels. And, I mean, I often, I graduated, high school in 1963. And people, do you know that was the year that there was the highest SAT scores? And then they say, and I say, well, how much higher? Oh, so it's 150 to 200 points higher on average than they take them today. Now, there is a little bit of bias because less people went to college, so it's a little bit more. But they normalize for that. And they just say, the standards have just gone down everywhere. So, it's more than just, a lot of colleges, not this one here, but a lot of colleges are teaching material that used to be taught in high school at the first 2 years, believe it or not. And, that's another issue.
Not here.
Yeah.
Not here, but I'm saying many
places. You had a little more time to think about it.
Yeah,
what's your favorite?
Let me tee up what Jeremy just said. If I had the one choice, it would be K through 12. I mean, that is still the part that is really lacking in America. And in particular, it's also heavily divided by race. In particular, and it's not just about money. It really, first of all, we have incredible segregation in K through 12 by race, but it's not just about money. If you just only look at predominantly Black schools and look how much we spend per kid, it still would be the highest in the OECD. Just factoring that way, it's not simply about money. There's a lot of other things that are being done there. And so the move towards social promotion, the fact that lots of our graduates are not able to do mathematics beyond the 6th grade, that create retraining is not going to be useful for a lot of that. And so that is really where I'd focus. And both sides are to blame, but that's a much longer discussion.
That's a longer conversation. I thought some of you would say tax cuts for struggling macroeconomists, but that's going to be some other time. I think that's all you have time for. Thank you so much, Kent, Jeremy. Thank you to all of our audience, both here and on LinkedIn. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we all did. I'm going to say just as a goodbye, please join us for the next event in this series on AI, technology, and the role of regulation. This is going to be on November 18th, and we're going to discuss, obviously, the challenges involved in adequately regulating AI and the innovation takes place in this country and abroad. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day, wherever you are.